Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Josh.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Let me introduce us. Let me just say too that I want to thank you in advance for your time. This is Labor Day. This is a holiday, and we're
We're
just
working.
working. We're demonstrating that meaning of life. We take it so seriously. There are no holidays.
That's right. We should be like,
Okay, so you're Stephen Asma, and you are a professor of philosophy at Columbia College in Chicago,
correct.
and you're also a working musician. You've been a
Yep.
professional blues and jazz guitarist for a number of years, which I'd like to hear about.
Yeah. Maybe 20 some years. Yeah.
And on your musical resume, which may not show up very much with your professional resume, but your musical resume, you've played with acts like B.B. King and Buddy Guy.
Yeah.
Any other
Very,
notables?
very fortunate. Yeah. BB King, Buddy Guy. I played with Bo Diddley many times. Coco Taylor, Lonnie Brooks, Junior Wells. It was a great, I was pretty active on the blues scene in Chicago in the 1990s, and that was a great time for blues music.
And what age would you have been in the 1990s?
Was very young. I was in my early 20s. So I was just like my career as a musician and my PhD were sort of happening at the same time.
Hmm.
So it was a great time, but it also eventually I had to choose between staying as a musician and becoming a professor. And I continue to play music, but now it's more like I get the call, "Hey, can you come and sub?" I can't go on tour and that kind of thing. It's a different kind of lifestyle.
Yeah. But there it is. I mean, particularly, we're going to be discussing your new book that's come out called "The Evolution of Imagination." And I would normally I'd hold up an image of the book, but through a strange series of events, I won an electronic or digital form of your
Oh, did
book.
you? That's right.
I think your publisher had some sort of deal that if
Yeah,
people shared an advertisement for the book on social media, their name would go into a hat.
that's right.
And having never won anything in my life, I'm happy to announce that I won the book. But I
But
don't.
you have no cover.
I have no cover, and even the format that you can view it on the e-reader, it's a specific e-reader that you have to read the book on,
Oh,
and that it renders the cover of the book just microscopically
oh,
small.
really?
Yeah.
Oh, unfortunate.
So,
I'd hold one up too, but
do you have a copy of that?
I'd have to go find one. Um, I do have one. Hold on one second.
Yeah, yeah. Here we are.
I didn't have to go too far, just to the back shelf there. Okay,
Perfect.
there. It's upside down.
It's upside down.
There it is. What the hell? This is like
It,
very counterintuitive.
I know it's like two mirrors reflected to each
Yeah.
other. And if the viewers see the cover there, they're going to see someone obviously is a drawn cover, and I'm going to guess based on your other skill set that you drew the cover. Is that an accurate
No,
guess?
I'd like to say I drew this cover because I really like it, but the design team at University of Chicago Press actually came up with that cover, and my illustrations are throughout the book. But they must have thought, okay, that's enough of you, Steve. Let's have somebody else do, do
Right.
the cover. I don't know, but they came up with a really nice image. It's sort of a bunch of people with light bulb heads going one direction, and then you can't quite make it out here, but the light bulb is on, and this person is going the opposite direction. It's kind of a nice symbol of imagination, sort of going against the flow and that kind of thing.
Right. What also get you? I think you picked up, or I picked up on your use of that metaphor at some stage in the book where you're talking about sometimes the light bulb is on as a top-down sort of awareness or centralized state of
Yeah,
awareness over on top of this churning, bubbling, underground, unconscious stream state of experience. But we're gonna that's a little bit ahead of ourselves. But you're a visual artist,
right.
and I've been following you now on social media for a bit, and it's it's impressive that it seems like once almost a day on a daily basis there's a new drawing
Yeah,
that turns up, and they're very good too. And I'm
thank
just
you.
sort of just wondering, what does your day look like?
Does this guy ever sleep? Well, yeah, it's a good question. Like I used to have, if you really want to do art, you want to have a studio of some kind, and I used to do oil painting, but when I had a kid, it's hard to sustain a studio because the turpentine smells, it's toxic. You can't have a baby running around with all this stuff. And I have to say that I've been sort of liberated in terms of my art because of the development of these new tablet
Mm,
drawing devices, which have really upped their game. I mean, 5 years ago, these things were incredibly awkward, and drawing on them was just dreadful. And in the last 5 years, I would say uh, Apple and Wacom have made these tablets that are very natural drawing surfaces. The styluses are very natural, and the way you draw, the way you build up and model an image is no different than if I was using, pastels or something. So I've been using these digital platforms. I still do, of course, physical artwork too, but in the evening time, when I think most people are watching TV, that's when I'm drawing. So it turns out if you don't watch TV, you have a lot of time, and you can accomplish a lot. Or I'll even put the TV on in the background if
mhm.
I'm tired and exhausted, and I'll draw almost as a kind of meditation or a way to relax.
Got it.
And it's a good thing for me to do almost every night.
Excellent. Well, that and because yeah, with the digital stuff, from the viewer's perspective, I couldn't tell what you were doing it on.
Yeah, I can't tell either.
Yeah.
It's gotten that good.
All right. Well, why don't we start out with the book, and then this is a sweeping book. I mean, it's looking at evolution, human evolution, and particularly the role imagination, the evolution of imagination itself, but then the role that imagination played for the species in its evolution, and then gets into sort of comparative philosophy, East and West, on how imagination can function and how to best optimize it. So there's a lot to maybe walk through here, but um, one of your central theses seems to be that imagination itself, the capacity for imagination, was a main driver in the evolution of our species. And you seem to be framing that against a view that the cognitive revolution was really um, turned on by the acquisition of language. But
Yeah,
there's a line somewhere I think I picked out from your text where you say language didn't start the cognitive revolution, dreaming did.
yeah.
So that's a big question or big theme, but walk me through that a little bit. Or
Yeah, I think I'm hoping that the book, uh, while it is sweeping and doesn't really solve all these problems, might open a bigger conversation about the imagination and its role in human evolution. Because I think there was a moment when it looked like it was going to happen, but sort of developments in psychology crushed it out. Developments in behaviorism and even philosophy itself has ignored the imagination for the most part ever since Kant.
Mhm.
Um, but I think to your actual question, I think what's happened is there's been two basic orientations to solving the problem or the question of why did Homo sapiens leap forward into such cultural sophistication and such cognitive sophistication, such that and really such ecological sophistication that they were able to dominate. As soon as they got out of Africa, we just were everywhere in a very short amount of time. And so, as you were pointing out, usually the explanation is, well, the brain got really big, we got language, and the neocortex is really big, and so logic and inferential propositional thinking basically is what drove all this success. So that's the kind of cognitive revolution view, which is rationality and language essentially gave us our dominance.
And so
The other,
and within that, like the development of the neocortex and rationality allowed us to transcend instinct and get beyond like.
right. Yeah, because if you look at language is the obvious case because language is a symbol system. So as soon as you have symbols, then you have an animal that's manipulating symbols that refer to or represent reality. Say, like you have the word buffalo, and it refers or represents an actual animal. As soon as you've got a system like that, you're up and running, and you have what Arnold Modell calls the second universe,
Right.
which is inside your head. And human beings are kind of just like no other creature in the sense that we live in this second universe. Um, but I take issue with this because I think for a number of reasons. I think one is that the evolution of language is probably very late. And in fact, the reason why this argument is usually given is, well, you see things like cave paintings and certain kinds of more sophisticated tools in the upper Paleolithic period. So this must indicate that language is now online, and so we're very sophisticated language users. We have a modern psychology or modern mind by around 50,000 years ago. This is sort of common wisdom. And my argument is actually we would have been making this separation of signs and symbols long before language, because like other animals, we can decouple the perception of a buffalo and store it as an image in the mind, and then re-access the imagery. And we do this all the time. And it looks like animals do this too during dreaming. So that's why I like the idea of dreaming being, Darwin calls it a kind of involuntary imagination.
Mm-hmm.
You go to sleep, and in your mind's eye, there's all this mixing and these scenarios of events that are related to the day's events, but it's not under intentional control. You don't have agency over it. It's pretty stream of consciousness. And so the argument I'm trying to make is that in between sort of language on the one hand, and then all these modules, this is the other path that the computationalists take. They say, well, for everything that a human being can do, there must be a module in the mind that does it. There's a module that detects whether somebody's cheating. There's a module that detects whether somebody else has a mind, theory of mind.
And the module signifies a kind of a group of cortical structures.
Yeah, I think it's funny because the dominance of the modularity hypothesis occurred sort of before the neuroscience revolution. So it was sort of hot in the 80s and 90s, sort of before neuroscience really came in. And most of the cognitive scientists were not and are not interested in what the brain-based synaptic patterns are that undergird these modules. They just think, well, if you can solve a problem of detect when somebody's cheating, there must be a module in the brain that does it. Very famously, I remember for Darwin's birthday celebrations, this was a few years ago, Mark Hauser, who subsequently has fallen on it sort of on hard times.
Yeah, that name. Yeah, there was something. He was a guy at Harvard.
He was hot as could be, and then his research was shown to have some unethical dimensions, and he's sort of he's in bad shape now in terms of his career. But he was like the keynote speaker, and he said, "Well, look, when everybody's heard the trolley car is going towards one person or five people, and how do we make this utilitarian calculus?" He said, "Well, there must be a module in the brain that is a utilitarian module." And all human beings evolved it. We don't know much more about it, but the sheer ubiquity of utilitarian ethical convictions indicates that it's there. Let's move on. And that's sort of how this cognitive science approach was working. So you have these two ways of approaching the mind, evolution of the mind. One is language and reason evolve in the giant neocortex, and the other is that we're made of all these fairly automatic modules. And I'm trying to say both these views are wrong, or at least they're limited.
Partially, yeah.
Yeah, and that what's underneath both these views is a operating system that I'm calling the imagination, and that imagination is actually a way of not just perceiving the world, but also generating information. So we don't just perceive and store, we also mix and create hybrids and composite images. So the imagination, I think, is very ancient. And I believe that it's probably our hominid ancestors would have had fairly sophisticated imaginations. And even our primate cousins probably have some rudimentary imaginations. Of course, once language gets in there, it changes. It's a game changer. Everything then explodes even more. But I think you can think with images and with your body.
I want to come to that in 1 second. But you make the case, or made the analogy, I think, that with dreaming, you sort of say that our current human experience of dreaming is probably somewhat similar to early hominid conscious state, right? That they were kind of more in a stream state where sensory impressions were coming and going, but they weren't having this sort of top-down executive function in relationship to it, similar to what we go through when we're not lucid in a dream.
Right, correct. Now that's highly speculative,
Right.
and I recognize that's highly speculative, and I do say in the book it could have been like this, but of course we don't know. I do think there's empirical maybe routes to this by studying animal psychology and the psychology of children. So it's not like I think this is a totally untestable hypothesis, but at this point, it's speculative, yeah. But the reason why I like this idea is because something like this must have been the case. I don't think the daily phenomenological experience of a Homo erectus would have been sort of incoherent and like crazy images coming, and confusing. I'm sure their daily life was pretty regular, but there's a sense in which what happens when, let me try to think of an analogy here, like you and I have some control over what imagery we bring up to the mind's eye. So like if I say, hey, think of a lion, you can do that with fairly amazing, skill. And I can even ask you I can describe it. I can put it in a scenario. It's chasing a leopard. You can run this kind of virtual reality in your mind. But at some point, if you're thinking about the evolution of the mind, you can't think, okay, our ancestors had a mind like that, because that's a very representationally sophisticated mind. You can pull up the representation, you can run it through a sequence in time, that you can give it a beginning, a middle, and end. Instead, what must have been happening is that our perceptions must have been stored, and then they must have like sort of rose up into conscious mind in a fairly unpredictable way. Sort of, and that's why I like the dreaming analogy, is that you're not controlling it. Like there must have been a time when, our ancestors are sitting around the fire and suddenly the memory of some horrific hunt or battle emerges in their conscious mind and startles them. Like it would probably contain all of the emotional affective triggers that the real perception had. And so we don't get full representational mind until we get a decoupling. I'm going to use this language here. Like we decouple the representation of the lion from the perception and the feeling of seeing a lion.
Or the ancestors by the fire. Are you saying they may not have decoupled their awareness from the memory coming up? Like they weren't right. They didn't have a frame around like this is just a memory. They were sort of experiencing like almost like post-traumatic stress in a way.
Yes, I think that's a very good analogy, because that's what happens to somebody who's experienced something so negatively, emotionally valenced, and then it emerges up, something triggers it in the environment. Yeah. And then it overpowers them because the decoupling is not complete, And presumably something like this must have been, if you take an animal, which is clearly has perception and memory, and I would argue emotion, but fairly rudimentary communication or language compared to us, fairly rudimentary representational systems. And then you take a sophisticated modern mind. Well, evolution suggests, things don't happen by saltational jumps. They happen by degrees. Presumably then the mind must have had a place that was in between a full representation, like I say dog, and you hear a vocal utterance and you think a four-footed mammal, and something that was more like, I suppose like, language theorists will say maybe snakes would have been represented by s, or something that was, some kind of representation that actually was sort of analog to the animal sound, and that would have preceded these more abstract symbols. So again, that's fairly speculative. I can't really say with confidence what the hominid mind was like, but I can't believe it was like our modern minds either. And so that's the trick, is to try to think back to a mind that didn't have language or sophisticated symbol systems. That's why in the book I try to start with the body. Like, how could you think with the body? Then how could you think with images? And then lastly, how could you think with language?
So that leads me into what I wanted to ask you about. It's a phrase you use for this paradigm of embodied cognition, right? So
Right.
the body has a kind of learning that it acquires. Walk me through that.
Well, I think you and I probably understand this. You do meditation, you
Yep.
do yoga. There's a sense in which your body, and dancers, for example, know this. You're kind of you're not just moving your body and exercising it, but you're also, I suspect, solving problems with your body. And I think if you look at the philosophical tradition, though, that I come out of, my own training, there's what I consider to be a naive view of the mind, which is it's a kind of Cartesian spectator. It's like a homunculus in the mind, and it's just watching the play of representations, and considering them. And this is sometimes even called the spectator view of the mind. I'm out of this tradition that comes sort of from the pragmatists like John Dewey, and now more recently, a great philosopher and sort of really a great teacher of mine, Mark Johnson, but also people like John Kaag. We all think that the mind is actually an extension of the body. So instead of a spectator that's just taking in perceptions and doing calculations, the mind instead is really more like internalized motion or internalized activity. And there's some recent data coming out of neuroscience that suggests that this is correct. So there's a great linguist named Bergen, and they've been looking at when you and I, like, if you take a cup like this, when I drink from the cup, you can see that parts of my brain, in the sort of frontal areas of the brain, but also basically the motor cortex stuff is all lit up because I'm solving a fairly complicated motor problem here of getting manipulating the cup to drink. But it turns out that if we put you in an fMRI machine and we just say the word cup, surprisingly, it's your motor areas that also light up. So that even when you're using a high-level representational word like cup, which is a totally conventional relationship to the actual object, sure enough, the brain actually goes to solve a motor problem, which I think is really exciting because it shows you that the mind has its roots in the body. And even these sophisticated metaphors we use, like, do you follow me? If I say, do you follow me? Mark Johnson has pointed out, like, there's all these metaphors we use for knowledge and insight, which are basically about your place in space and time.
Reference through bodily activity.
Right. So I think the work that Johnson and Lakoff have done on language is pretty compelling. I think that there's probably even earlier work that again is a little bit speculative, but if you look at the ways in which pre-literate groups solve social bonding problems, it has to do with physical grooming. So touch is really crucial. The way in which the group comes together and grooms each other is basically a kind of body problem solving, because oftentimes, like, if you've irritated me, in the hunt or whatever, you're not sharing, we have to patch that up somehow. How do we do that when we don't have language? We do it through touch. Mm-hmm. So too, dance probably emerged as a way to forge social solidarity among groups. It wasn't just like an artistic thing. Let's go out on Saturday night and enjoy the dance. It was a way of forging a kind of group a collective consciousness. And it's even has adaptive significance because as a group, you could dance together and show your enemy that you're not just kind of committed to each other. You guys are like a single organism. Don't mess with us.
Right.
You
Yeah,
know,
I was going to ask you about
dangerous.
that. And in regard to that, there's a lot going on in that group dance formation, like the capacity to do that. The phrase that I remember you mentioning was the idea that humans really are the only ones that can fall into sync, which
Right.
is it's something I hadn't really appreciated before. Like we think about being able to speak and light fire, all that stuff, but to get into literally a groove.
Yeah, that is. I was really intrigued to find that literature. It's technically called entrainment,
Yeah.
and like if I start clapping a rhythm out, you can follow me, and basically you can have a whole room doing this in just a matter of seconds. But it turns out that the other animals, including the apes, are terrible at this. They can't seem to do it. Now, I mean, I don't know why that is exactly. I mean, you can always have this sort of nature and nurture debate about this. Is there a module for entrainment?
Hmm.
And we have that module flipped on and other primates don't? Is it a kind of acculturation? But it seems to me that there's been experiments on chimps, I think bonobos, don't quote me on this, but where they have tried to teach the animal over long periods of time to engage in trained clapping or beating a drum. They've even put chimps on musical instruments to see if they'll like engage in something like a kind of collective project, and it's fairly disastrous. So like
Yeah.
it doesn't go well at all.
Although I think I've seen even the YouTube of some dog, some like border collie that's able to play along with music or
That I haven't seen that, but that wouldn't surprise me as much because I think dogs and the dog mind and the human mind are probably the closest coevolutionary, partnership that we've had over really tens of thousands of years, probably 20,000 years. And so, in the same way that dogs understand pointing, like if I point over here, a dog will actually look to where I'm pointing, but no other primate does that.
Mhm.
And I think that's the result. There's some great work on this by Michael Tomasello and others that dogs have evolved a way of tracking our eyes and our finger gestures. They read them in the way we want them to,
They also
whereas
read
chimps don't.
human emotion, right, on
Right,
face. Yeah.
right. So that doesn't surprise me. We need a band of dog
Border.
improvisers.
Well, actually, that's a good segue point to a pivot point. What's the relationship between imagination and improvisation?
Yeah,
Like,
that's
what are working definitions for these terms, and then maybe how have both of them conferred evolutionary benefit?
yeah. I'm thinking of imagination as a kind of master simulation system, basically. So all the things we've been talking about, I think human beings are able to solve many problems by simulation.
Mhm.
And traditional philosophers have thought, well, you don't have knowledge of something until you have it in a sort of propositional format. And I'm arguing throughout this book that actually simulating something with your body or with an image by drawing it is a kind of knowledge. So my view of imagination is that it's a kind of faculty or really a system by which we are able to create new ideas, concepts, images that are not immediately present to the senses. That's really, I think, a general definition of the imagination. I try to trace how that could have been at first an involuntary system and slowly over time a voluntary system where you actually have control over it. Because in dreams, the other day I was dreaming of like a dragon with no control of my own. But of course, Walt Disney and Hayao Miyazaki, will intentionally create an amazing image by blending like a snake and a bird of prey into a dragon. The combinatorial activity is all imagination, just some of it's involuntary and some of it's voluntary. My view of improvisation is that improvisation is probably the earliest form of imagination. I think of it as the activity of the imagination. Um, and I like this basic distinction that has gotten legs. I think Daniel Kahneman is probably the most well-known proponent of this idea of a system one and system two consciousness or mind. Sometimes I like to call it hot and cold cognition.
Mm-hmm.
So the hot cognition system is very fast and rapid. It reads a situation very quick. Like if I throw something at your head, you know how to dodge it very quickly. It's very instinctual and quick. But it's also not just pure instinct. It's the learning. It has the ability to learn. It's the associational system that provides us with things like behavioral conditioning. Mm-hmm. The cold cognition system seems to ride on top of this hot cognition system. It's slower. It's basically what we think of as reason or calculation. And so what I think is happened in terms of evolution, my own view is that the hot cognition system must have been there long before the cold cognition system. I mean, if you think about a classic example of cold cognition is like doing a math problem or engaging in linguistic behavior or modeling something using language. But if language and things like math didn't evolve until like 50,000, maybe let's even be generous and say 100,000 years ago, that's nothing compared to the hot cognition system, which is probably that's probably hundreds of thousands of years older. And if we think about the fact that many mammals share our emotional system and have a simulation system that can also be conditioned, then the sort of evolution of mammals goes back to something like 200 million years. Mm-hmm. So my view is that the brain is originally this kind of embodied emotional system, and then sort of cold cognition is built on top of it. I'm trying to sort of understand the emotion or the imagination with using these two systems. Improvisation is definitely a hot cognition system because you've got to do it in real time. So if you're a jazz musician or you're a comedian and you're improvising, then you're simultaneously composing and performing. Whereas somebody who's writing a play, of course, has the luxury of time. You get to slowly work it out.
Review and edit, right?
Yeah, and there's this wonderful editorial phase that you can do in cold cognition imagination. But in hot cognition imagination, you're in front of an audience. You've got to play and play well, and also be responding to these people in a way that makes sense, that's adaptive to the harmony that's going on, the rhythm that's going on. So in that sense, I'm interested in improvisation as the earliest kind of thinking and the earliest kind of mind. It's highly receptive when it's good, and it's also involves turn taking. So these are the kind of prerequisites for later imagination and later forms of language. And so that's my goal is to sort of try to take a philosopher's and a sort of psychologist's view of improvisation.
And the way it confers evolutionary adaptive benefit, right?
Yeah.
So that's the piece I was trying to have you maybe speak to a little bit more. Like how does the capacity to improvise, like what is that going to do in our ancestral development?
Yeah, that's a great question. It looks like if you look at the development of tool technology, you'll see these simple biface axes, the Oldowan technology. They emerge, I want to say, maybe 1.5 million years ago. Let's be conservative and say 1 million years ago. But basically, Oldowan tools stay the same for like over 1 million years,
wow.
And with very little change. And then all of a sudden, tool technology like flourishes and explodes, and you start to get much more sophisticated tools. My suspicion is then that the success of Homo erectus would have been to retain and repeat tried and true technological methods. So keep making this biface rock because it allows you to skin things and kill things. And if we just keep doing this, we're going to survive. And so, just like any, go ahead.
If it's not broke, don't fix it.
That's it, exactly. Sustain the life ways that have kept us alive. What happens, though, is that when the environment changes dramatically, you get tremendous climate change. And this does happen. There's a wonderful paleoanthropologist, Rick Potts, and if you go to the Smithsonian Hall of Human Evolution, Potts basically has arranged that whole Smithsonian Hall according to this argument, which is that human development, both the development of the brain, but also these technological developments, seem to mirror or respond to very high, very strong changes in the environment. It gets very, very cold. It gets very, very hot in a short amount of time. So the argument there is that you have to get much more imaginative and improvisational when the environment is throwing you all these curveballs. And what it looks like, I think that there's just new work being done on this. It looks like we get better solving subsistence problems. Like how do we, when we have to move out of, when the grasslands go away, or when the forests go away and become these savanna grasslands, we have to change our hunting techniques, which means we need to improvise or imagine new tools. When we basically move into coastal areas, we have to learn how to fish or even create boats. So my argument here is one that's not very controversial. It's just that when the environment is so complicated and demanding, then some improvisational thinking is going to be rewarded because it's going to create innovative technologies. And so that's basically the logic of it.
Got it.
And in fact, like not have one of the things about improvisation that is it oftentimes you have to do it without the best kind of resources. You have to improvise with, I've got like, you've got to MacGyver together some kind of device, and you just got a fork and like a rubber band. And the beauty of that has to be sort of put in the equation here, because it forces a kind of lateral thinking. And that's what also creates innovation too.
Mm-hmm. And maybe to build on that, and this is sort of relevant to where we are politically now, how does the capacity for improvisation as a species develop a kind of moral sense or a progress on an ethical front? And that's probably a big question, but I mean,
it is.
I think you do get into that a bit in the book.
Yeah, at the end of the book, I try to think like, well, what are some imaginative cultures? What are some improvising cultures, and what's the opposite of that? My view here is not to sort of just romanticize the imagination and improvisation. Like it can be put to some horrific political purposes. You can imagine all kinds of ways to torture your enemy. You can improvise all kinds of ways to hurt people. So it's not like the more imaginative you are, automatically you're going to have a moral compass. But a number of people, I suppose, starting with people like Karl Popper, noticed that the open society is one that encourages imagination and improvisation. Democracy really thrives when people are allowed to try things and fail, and then repurpose, things to other ends. And the closed society, the totalitarian society, is very afraid of imagination and improvisation. There's this moment, in Mao Zedong's development, where after the Great Leap Forward, and sort of right before sort of during the Cultural Revolution, he said, well, let's have all 100 flowers bloom, and let's let everybody voice their own ideas about how to go forward in this great experiment of socialism or communism. And so people sort of started criticizing the government and criticizing him and offering suggestions, and then he came down on them, and basically he ended up like wiping out these people as counter-revolutionaries. So the idea of having a culture and a society that cherishes real imagination is something that is something we have to constantly be vigilant about. We've lost some of it, I think, recently, given the current political climate. Um, but I think that what we're looking at is the ability to imagine the life of another person. So if we're going to have a social system that's based on some kind of moral vision, then the question is, how do you know what's best for people? And my argument in the book is, it's not a utilitarian calculus like, well, we have a policy that's for the greatest good for the greatest number. There's a sort of a very popular movement of effective altruism that's very hot right now, which is just do a sort of rational assessment of how many people will benefit versus how many people will lose, and then make your difficult choices along these rational lines. I'm of the view that empathy matters, and that the only way you can have empathic and good policies is to also sort of put yourself in the shoes of another person. So I use some sort of obvious cases like Charles Dickens creates A Christmas Carol as a way to show sort of Victorian British people the dignity of the poor. And so works of imagination, films, television, novels, they can show us what it's like to be black in America living in Baltimore. I watched this series like after everybody else loved it, called The Wire. And I thought, this is like the most morally sophisticated and nuanced representation of a set of problems and conditions for people. And so it shows you that imagination is not just this kind of window dressing that comes after all the other really important work. It's actually at the base, the foundation of moral vision and therefore social policy. So I'm trying to bring imagination back as the font of moral vision too.
That's great. I want to be mindful of time here, but there's another section of the book that gets into kind of, which I kind of read a little bit like slightly as self-help. So in full disclosure,
Oh no.
no. Well, that's the caveat around it. But I like you. I used to play music more, and I would describe myself as a failed improviser.
Okay, what was your instrument?
Saxophone.
Saxophone. Okay.
And I took lessons. I studied jazz, and I feel like I was able to cobble together some of the basic skill sets of being a musician. Like I could make a sound, I could play reasonably well in time, this and that. But when it came to improvising, all that came out was just gobbledygook. It just it didn't, except for maybe I think there's one in reading your book. I had a memory of one time in high school jazz class
Where you nailed it.
something happened. It was
Yeah.
we were playing Pent Up House by Sonny Rollins,
Oh, great.
and the teacher had given us this little idea to play with during the improv, and I think I got into a flow state where suddenly everything lit up. I was like, it wasn't me kind of lost amongst the background music of the other musicians. It was all integrated and it was happening. But that was a once off.
You got lucky.
But I've always been kind of interested in that creative process, and I've also been, as a consumer, been very impressed with jazz artistry. The question in the book you sort of talk about how a lot of creatives go to great ends to kind of facilitate their ability to either transcend a certain kind of self-sense or repress it enough or knock it up, get it offline so that
Hmm.
some other kind of mental process is able to be accessed and unleashed. And I would like to talk to you about a little bit about that. Like, what are your thoughts on how someone could develop themselves? Because I think it's not just relevant to, say, music. It's like, I think one of the cases you make is that we're all improvisers in our
Yeah.
life.
Right.
Whether it's we're walking our dog on the street and we bump into somebody, we improvise a conversation. maybe we're improvising in the kitchen, at work, in the bedroom, wherever we are, we're improvising to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The idea of music or jazz being a paragon case, I think is attractive, and you do too because you've got some experience with it. But I wouldn't want to put people off and think this is really about jazz. You're right. This is about everything we do. We're constantly improvising, and the question is, how do you become a better improviser? Um, and I think it's first you need to get back to your saxophone, and we'll have to do some jamming together sometime. But I would say like the greats will do this thing where they practice, practice, practice. It's insane amounts of practice. Somebody like Miles Davis or Bird or Herbie Hancock. These guys are practicing like they're just playing like 8, 12 hours a day. So they're solving all kinds of problems when the stakes are low, when nobody's listening and nobody cares. And then I think what they do is they've basically taken this cold cognition system, because think about music theory, it's very complicated. You have to understand like, well, this note will work over a minor chord, but this note won't. And then you have to practice, practice, practice to get this, what is essentially a mathematical system. Our music is basically like the modal system handed down from the Greek tradition. And you've got to understand theory, and that's all cold cognition. But I think what's happening is that cold cognition is modulating the hot cognition system by actually sculpting embodied habit patterns. So muscle memory in the hand, let's say. Most people who play music know that they get to a part of a song and they're like, God, I hope my hand remembers this because I can't remember it. There's this breath, yeah, and then your hand does it, and you're like, oh, thank God. But what's happening there, I think, is that you've been slowly over hours and weeks and months and years contouring the hot cognition system and creating through habit, basically through repetition. You're conditioning the hot cognition system. And you're making it more and more sophisticated and supple and also responsive. Then what happens is these guys who are great jazz players will refuse to rehearse. We'll just meet at the club and we'll have some ideas for songs. And without rehearsal, I can't overthink it. I have to really just go to that hot cognition system. And now I'm just in an instinctual kind of call and response relationship with the other players. I'm applying the rules I know about what modes work with what chords, what kind of words can work in a certain conversation, what kind of herbs and spices will work with these kinds of meats and poultry. But I'm not applying. It's not an algorithmic solution to the problem. It's not the application of a rule that always covers it. It's more like what Aristotle called phronesis, which is a kind of practical judgment or practical wisdom. And it's infused and informed by all kinds of theoretical knowledge, but it's basically now letting the embodied hot cognition system sort of run on its own.
Which is sort of contrary to the kind of prevalent narrative that these musicians or these artistic types are inherently creative. Like they're somehow unique, and that they just pick up something and out comes confirmation or something. Like out comes this beautiful thing. But you're right, it's the 10,000 hours or whatever it is that of cold cognitive training that embeds it down into the hot cognition system, and then but coming back then to this idea around how, because in a certain way you could imagine, or I would imagine that for me, I think the cold cognition system was never able to get out of the way. Like it was sort of jamming up the gears.
Yeah,
and
sounds like it.
It's like I see a chord. How do I play? Oh, it's already gone. And wait, where am I now in this? Like,
that's right. Well, it's like the job is never done, for one thing. Like the fact that you struggled with that, these high level guys are still struggling with it too, but they're just up here, overthinking, and then they have to try to, they have to try to turn the brake on the sort of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which we think now through neuroscience we have an understanding that if you shut this part off, then it allows for more of this older brain system to do the associations and the sort of hot cognition work. And so what artists have always done is they've tried to turn that for sort of overthinking executive control off, using alcohol, using drugs. Um, People can do it by taking walks in nature. I always laugh when I read that Woody Allen takes these like hour-long showers, and while he's in the shower, it's when he has all his creative breakthroughs, because you're so in that executive control, overthinking, task positive mode all the time that you have to find a way to turn that off or turn it down in order for this older problem solving system, which is very emotional, very simulation based, to actually rise to the top. And it sounds like what was happening with you is you were overthinking this chord and that chord. It's sort of like when you're learning a language too. Like my Chinese is not bad, but I notice if I stop and think too much and try to like translate this word in this context, rather than just kind of going for it and screwing it up and going for it again and screwing it up, like you can overthink the learning of a language too. And it's almost better to just go in and make mistakes and slowly tinker it out than I guess the model would be like the mind works more, the kind of mind that we're talking about now works more like, not like a chess game where you're thinking about all the rules and applying to every move. It's more like an ecological psychologist used this metaphor, which I love. It's more like making a jigsaw puzzle where you're sort of doing a kind of fumble and find. Like, I think it might fit there, and I'm just going to try it. And squeak, no, it doesn't. I turn it to the side. No, it doesn't. Okay, that one fit. That's different than applying like a rule to a particular and drawing an inference, a deduction. So I think there's some of that going on in the great improvisers. They've trained themselves up, and then they're just letting this hot cognition blow.
Would you like to say anything about maybe a bad improviser who's not trained things up very well and is just letting things blow at the moment?
Yeah,
Has anyone come to mind?
You could argue that our current leader may be a bad improviser. I think I made this argument elsewhere, and I think I'll commit to it again, which is, one of the things that I think people like about somebody like our president is that he's not careful, and he just sort of goes into the room like a bull in a china shop, and he just crashes around. And the assumption I think many of the voters had who liked him was that he was going to take a kind of get things done business model into the arena of politics, and that would break the kind of sclerotic, rule-based, atrophied system of Washington. And that, people held out hope for that, I think, reasonably. I think that was actually a reasonable hope, because Washington is just a nightmare. But what seems to have happened is that you've got a guy, I'm trying to think of an analogy here, like, what's an analogy? Like, let's say I've only ever learned jazz music, and now I'm going to have to improvise my way through a break in a classical piece. It can be disastrous.
Yeah,
Like,
I was imagining some like rock and roll guitarist showing up to play jazz.
Yeah, perfect. That's a good example, because the amp is too loud, the riffs don't fit, but he doesn't care. He's just wailing.
He's the rock star.
He's a rock star. So he's got some Hendrix riff over a light, ballad, a sort of, and yeah. So there's a mismatch between what Trump is doing and what Trump is trying and what is actually needful. So oftentimes I think what's happening with a bad improviser is they're not listening. They're not receptive to others. The great improvisers are listening to the people around them. And I don't mean like they're just listening to what they say. They're listening to what's needed around them. They're receptive to the environment. A bad improviser, and I think Trump is a bad improviser, is just going full steam ahead like our rock star analogy. Doesn't care, doesn't even hear the problems. And as long as there's a big noise and a lot of attention, he thinks his work is done. Also, I think narcissistic people make bad improvisers in general. President included or not, depends on your view of him. It's pretty clear that if somebody gets up in an improvisational setting and just plays nonstop and never turns it over to anybody else, or in a conversation they never stop, or anything like this, then you see that there's somebody there that's not improvising well because they're not engaging with the social group, and so that also makes a bad improviser.
Yeah, actually, the phrase that the word this came to mind is the idea of a generous improviser. Like
Yeah,
sometimes that's with around jazz musicians.
that's
That's
right.
used that where they go to a show and say someone was, wow, he was just so, or she was so generous in the way she
Yes.
played.
Yeah, that's a great example because they're hearing what you're doing, trying to basically like accent and compliment what you're doing, and that's an act of that's interesting. It's a kind of an ethics of improvisation, and that's something I didn't talk too much about, but it really does get to this issue. Um, and I guess I'm thinking here about the other problem. I guess is somebody who's a generous improviser is somebody with a lot of experience in this area of music playing. And a bad improviser just has either experience in another domain or they just haven't had enough experience.
I wanted to get into meditation a little bit, but I think we're coming to our time, so we may have
Are we?
to. Yeah. Well, do you have a few more minutes?
Yeah, I have a few more minutes. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about your practice and how improvisation relates to meditation and to yoga.
Yeah. Well, so you talk about this in the book too. You talk about sort of the relationship between meditative practice, specifically more Buddhist-based meditation, and how that prepares someone to kind of get. What I heard was kind of preparing them to get into more of a flow state.
Hmm.
You know, because the self when the meditation is going well, the self is decentered in a way, and
Right.
it's able to access more of a stream state. Um, and I think that's kind of the sort of the typical paradigmatic view around meditation, that we're going to quiet down the thinking, the machination of the mind, and literally get out of your own way to allow this other
Right.
thing to unfold. The very thing I was unsuccessful at doing in jazz,
Right. That's right.
which is why, maybe that's what got me into meditation. Is like, how do I
I'll
how
get
do
better
I
at
how do
this.
I stop this stuff? Um, but as I was reading the book, I've started meditating in a different way, which implicitly allows thinking to go on. So rather than trying to cut that off and focus on more of a sensory based present moment experience, I've opened my practice up to letting myself go into any kind of terrain that seems to naturally come up. Um, so that might get me into kind of hypnagogic states,
Mm.
which are often discouraged. It might have me full on planning a trip or planning
Mhm.
something in the future or rehashing something in the past. But as I was reading your book and thinking about this approach to practice, to me it felt like this approach also then directly allowed me to explore the inner simulation, the
Mm.
second universe, in a
Hmm.
way that like I could kind of like the jazz musician would be practicing a lick, I could practice a topic,
Oh yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
then and sort of like, oh, try it in my mind this way, or run the
Okay.
simulation this way, which again would not be considered sort of kosher meditative process in like
But I like it. I
a
like it.
but it I have found that it does sort of it leads to more real world application, in the sense that I've in the inner simulation I've gone through something several
Yeah.
times,
Yeah.
and then find that usually when I get to the gig, as it were, like the metaphorical gig,
Yeah.
whatever situation it is, I have a little bit more situational awareness around it.
Yeah,
and I should also add that's after practicing more of the conventional approach for
sure.
15 plus years. Because I was appreciative of the way you mentioned this. You said the present moment, as it's often treated, is the most unimaginative
Right. Right.
state.
That's right. People forget that. They think, oh, that it must be great, but then there's no future in it. There's no past in it. There's in just the present moment, and you're supposed to empty your mind. In some traditions, you're supposed to empty the
Right,
mind,
right.
and so what you are left with is this bare, at the most, like some vague field consciousness of some kind. So I thought that was funny that it's actually the most unimaginative. You're supposed to you're dissuaded from doing the kind of imaginative thinking in what I would call traditional Buddhist meditation.
Right.
But I like what you're up to there because you're not engaging in traditional discursive thought. You're sort of more uh, looking at the elements of the simulation, rather than like full on. Here's what I'm going to do, tomorrow when I meet my boss or something.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of work that is going to be interesting on this coming out of neuroscience too, because I was surprised. If I thought, oh, when you get into the flow state, that must be when you've turned off the task positive network and you're just full into the default mode network, which is a part of the brain that is usually lit up when we're doing this kind of mind wandering.
So
But in
yeah,
fact,
if you just want to clarify those two, I mean, I'm familiar with those two networks, but just for people that may have not
yeah,
come
well,
across them recently.
I think this idea of the default mode network is old, but it's gotten more and more attention as neuroscience has gotten better, and we found, that there are these certain areas of the brain that light up when we release our mind from a particular task, like how like at school you're just looking out the window and just letting your mind wander. Um, this is basically what the mind goes to when the task consciousness it goes into rest. You stop a task, and this is contrasted with the task positive network, which is another series of brain communications, between these different parts of the brain, and that is very active when you're solving a math problem or you're engaging in some kind of task, whatever it is. Um, and my assumption was that the flow state would be this default mode network. But when you actually look at the brains of some of these virtuosic meditators, it looks like they're not in default mode network, they're in task positive network. And that's was surprising to many people, myself included. Now, how to interpret that is interesting. Like, I was talking to a Zen meditator recently who said, well, that made sense to him because it's so much work to bring your mind to the present moment that it can't be this relaxed default mode network. It must be that you're enlisting all of your cognitive attention
Hmm.
just to bring your attention to this present moment. Because you're in certain traditions, you're always blocking out um, ruminations that want to infiltrate, or you're letting them pass through the mind without judgment or without following them. Both those activities, it looks like, also engage this task positive network. Now, I think what's interesting is we're going to find it's more complicated than that too, and that the two systems seem to toggle back and forth, even like in a simple activity.
Well, that's the toggling back and forth is actually what I think is going on in the approach that I'm applying now, where you might be kind of drifting in a default mode state for a bit, but then say something juicy comes up,
Yeah.
and you like rather than just having it sort of ruminating subconsciously, you actually sort of bite into it for a while.
Okay. Good.
You can feel the
Yeah.
mind bite into it, which then switches into more a task positive, I would say, to use your phrase, task positive state, which can then lead into very strong states of absorption or concentration
Right.
through indirect means. It's typically you might try to focus on the breath as a way of getting into an absorbed focus state, but making a list or getting for finding an argument or preparing for something in your mind.
Right.
Actually, I've seen now it has the similar function of being able to lead laterally into kind of a deep state of concentration.
Yeah, and there is something as you're talking there, I'm thinking about the Buddha's original recommendation on mindfulness in the Theravada tradition, at least, is when you want to you want to meditate on the impermanence of the body, which requires, like you were saying, let's say the idea of your own body comes into consciousness, then you need to, like you said, bite into it, so to speak, metaphorically, and stay with it and actually okay, the Buddha walks you through this meditation of like, well, here's how the flesh decomposes. Here's how, you end up being picked by birds or whatever.
Right.
It looks morbid, but it's a kind of, it's sort of, I can see that it would enlist the task positive network to stay on topic and move it through a sequence of meditational maneuvers. Yeah, it's fascinating. I think there's going to be more on this in the next decade.
Yeah. No, it is good. Well, again, I just do. I feel like I've entered a bit of a flow state just listening to you throughout this chat. I really want to appreciate or thank you and appreciate your willingness to sit down and chat with me on a holiday like this.
Oh, it was a great pleasure, and you
Yeah,
had excellent questions, and I totally enjoyed the conversation.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, just if anyone wants to be able to find you, do you have a website?
Yeah, I have a www Stephen Asma. It's Stephen with a PH, stephenasma.com, and people can contact me on Facebook. And I just started Twitter, although I'm still not quite getting the hang of that. But I'm all over if you just search my name.
Great. And the new book, The Evolution of Imagination. I didn't mention this in the intro, but you often do show up sometimes in the New York Times
Right.
Stone column. There's some
Yeah,
good.
I write a lot for the New York Times, and have written a lot of things for the Chronicle of Higher Education. And there's a wonderful
And Aeon.
yeah, Aeon is a great online magazine, which I suspect many of the viewers already know, but please go and visit them. They produce such great work, and I have a new piece coming out there really in a couple of weeks.
Great. All right, Stephen. Well, I'll be following you and hope to hear from you soon.
Likewise, Josh, it was a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks.
Take care.